Have you ever prayed with tears in your eyes and still heard nothing? Have you ever done everything right and still watched your life fall apart? Have you ever asked God, why me? Why now? Why this pain? And the scariest question of all, if God loves me, why would He allow this? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand something that changes how you see pain, silence, delays, and unanswered prayers forever. This message is not for people who have it all together. This message is for the tired, the confused, the broken, the ones who are still praying, even though they don't understand anymore. If that's you, don't leave. This might be the word your soul has been waiting for. There comes a moment in life when faith stops feeling inspirational and starts feeling heavy. A moment when believing in God doesn't feel like strength anymore, but like a question you're almost afraid to ask out loud. It's that season when you did everything you were told was right. You prayed sincerely. You waited patiently. You trusted deeply, and yet somehow things still fell apart. The door you believed God would open slammed shut without warning. The relationship you prayed over ended painfully. The opportunity you thought was answered prayer disappeared. And suddenly you're standing in a place you never expected to be, asking yourself how obedience led you here. This is the part nobody prepares you for. The part where trusting God doesn't come with clarity. The part where your faith is tested not by temptation, but by confusion. Because it's easy to trust God when life is moving forward, when prayers are answered quickly, when blessings are visible and progress is obvious. But real faith begins when nothing makes sense anymore, when heaven feels quiet, when the plan you thought God had for your life looks nothing like the life you're actually living. In these moments, the hardest thing isn't pain itself. The hardest thing is not understanding why the pain exists. You can handle struggle if it has meaning. You can endure suffering if you know the purpose behind it. But when the reason is hidden, when there's no explanation, when God doesn't give answers on your timeline, that's when faith feels like it's slipping through your fingers. You start replaying everything in your mind. Did I hear God wrong? Did I make the wrong choice? Did I misunderstand His voice? Was I too hopeful? Too trusting? Too naive? And slowly, without realizing it, doubt doesn't attack your belief in God's power. It attacks your trust in His intentions. You still believe God can do anything. You're just not sure anymore if He will do it for you. That's where many people quietly pull away. Not dramatically. Not loudly. They don't announce it. They don't stop believing altogether. They just stop expecting. They keep praying. But their prayers are guarded now. They still say they trust God, but deep down, they're preparing themselves for disappointment. They lower their hopes, so the pain won't be as sharp next time. And what they call maturity is often just wounded faith trying to survive. But here is a truth that changes everything. If you let it sink deep into your spirit, God's plan will often make absolutely no sense in the moment you're living it. not because God is careless, not because He is distant, and not because He has forgotten you, but because you are seeing one frame of a story He sees in full. You are standing inside the chapter while He already knows the ending. Think about how limited human vision really is. You judge situations by what you feel today. God judges them by what they will produce tomorrow. You see loss. God sees protection. You see delay. God sees preparation. You see rejection. God sees redirection. And the tragedy is not that we don't understand God's plan. The tragedy is that we assume our lack of understanding means something has gone wrong. Sometimes God allows things you would never choose, to build things you could never develop on your own. Strength doesn't grow in comfort. Patience doesn't form in ease. Depth isn't created in shallow waters. And faith that can survive unanswered questions is far stronger than faith that only survives miracles. There are moments when God will intentionally not explain Himself, not to punish you, not to confuse you, but because explanation would remove the need for trust. If God laid out every step clearly, faith would be reduced to agreement. But faith was never meant to be agreement with logic. Faith is surrender to sovereignty. You have to understand this deeply. God does not operate on your emotional timeline. He operates on eternal purpose. And eternity requires patience that often feels unbearable in the present moment. That's why waiting hurts so much. That's why silence feels so loud. That's why trusting God in confusion feels heavier than trusting Him in crisis. Because crisis still feels active. Confusion feels like being stuck. Yet even in that stuck place, God is working. Even when nothing is moving externally, something is shifting internally. You may feel like your life is on pause, but God is not idle. He is rearranging things you cannot see. He is protecting you from outcomes you don't know. He is closing doors you would have walked through that would have cost you more than you realize. And here is the uncomfortable truth most people don't want to hear. Some prayers are not answered because the version of the blessing you're asking for would harm the future God is trying to give you. Some relationships don't work because the connection would limit your growth. Some opportunities disappear because success without maturity can destroy you. And God cares more about who you are becoming than what you are receiving. This is why trust becomes so critical when understanding disappears. Because if you only trust God when His decisions align with your expectations, then your trust is actually conditional. And conditional trust is not faith. Faith is saying, even when this doesn't make sense, even when this hurts, even when I don't see the reason, I still believe God is good. That kind of trust doesn't come naturally. It is built through tears. It is forged in disappointment. It is strengthened in moments where you choose to believe God's character over your circumstances. And that choice is not easy. It feels like letting go of control. It feels like stepping into the unknown without guarantees. It feels like vulnerability without safety nets. But here's what makes this trust powerful. When you trust God without understanding, You are declaring that His wisdom is greater than your logic. You are acknowledging that His perspective is higher than your pain. You are saying that even though you don't see the full picture, you trust the one who painted it. And one day, often much later, something strange happens. You look back at the season that almost broke you. The season that made no sense. The season where you questioned everything. And you realize that what felt like abandonment was actually alignment. What felt like loss was actually protection. What felt like delay was actually mercy. You begin to see connections you couldn't see before. You notice how that closed door kept you from something destructive. You recognize how that waiting season matured you. You understand how that pain deepened your compassion. And suddenly, the confusion that once haunted you becomes the testimony that strengthens you. But you don't get that clarity while you're inside the storm. You get it after you survive it. Which means faith must come before understanding. Trust must come before explanation. And obedience must come before comfort. So if you're in that place right now, where God's plan doesn't make sense, where your heart feels heavy, where your prayers feel unanswered, where your future feels uncertain, know this: you are not forgotten, you are not off track, you are not being punished, you are being shaped. And the shaping process is rarely gentle. It presses you, it stretches you, it exposes your limits, it forces you to rely on God in ways you never had to before. But it also builds something unshakable inside you. A faith that does not collapse when life becomes unclear. A trust that does not depend on outcomes. A confidence rooted not in circumstances, but in God's unchanging nature. You may not understand why God allowed this chapter. You may not see how this fits into His plan. But you don't need understanding to keep going. You need trust. And trust doesn't mean pretending it doesn't hurt. Trust means choosing to believe God is still working even while it hurts. And if you can hold on through this season, if you can keep trusting, even when nothing makes sense, you will one day realize that this was the moment your faith became real. Not loud, not performative, not borrowed from others, but deeply personal, deeply rooted, and strong enough to carry you through anything that comes next. There is a kind of faith that feels warm and reassuring, the kind that grows easily when prayers are answered and life feels steady. And then there is another kind of faith, the kind that is forged in darkness, the kind that does not feel comforting at all. This is the faith you are forced to reach for when God feels silent and nothing around you makes sense anymore. When the signs stop coming, when the clarity you are waiting for never arrives, when you feel like you are walking forward, but every step is taken in the dark. Silence is one of the hardest tests of trust. Because pain at least gives you something to react to. Loss gives you something to grieve. But silence leaves you alone with your thoughts. It leaves you questioning whether God is listening, whether He is near, whether He is still involved in your life at all. And in those moments, doubt does not usually arrive as rebellion. It arrives as exhaustion. You are tired of waiting, tired of hoping, tired of believing without seeing any change. You still want to trust God, but you don't know how to keep trusting when there are no answers to hold on to. This is where many people quietly lose heart. They don't stop praying, but their prayers feel empty. They don't stop believing, but belief feels distant. They show up, they go through the motions. They say the right words, but inside they are wrestling with a deep, aching question. Why would a loving God stay silent when his child is hurting? Why would he allow confusion to last this long? Why would he ask for trust without giving reassurance? What makes this silence so painful is that it feels personal. It feels like being ignored. It feels like being overlooked. It feels like calling out into the dark and hearing your own voice echo back. And if you're not careful, that feeling can slowly convince you that God's silence means his absence. But silence and absence are not the same thing. God can be deeply present and still choose to be quiet. There are moments when God does not speak because he is doing something far more important than explaining. He is strengthening your ability to walk without constant reassurance. He is teaching your faith to stand on truth rather than emotion. Because feelings change, circumstances shift, and seasons pass, but trust rooted in God's character can survive when everything else falls apart. Think about how often we confuse God's presence with his activity. We assume that if God is working, we will feel it. We assume that if God is close, we will sense it. But some of the most significant work God does in our lives happens beneath the surface, where there are no emotional signals and no visible evidence. Just because you don't feel God does not mean he has moved away from you. Often, it means he is inviting you into a deeper kind of faith, one that does not depend on emotional confirmation. This is where walking by faith becomes real. Not the kind of faith that sounds good in conversation, but the kind that feels heavy in practice. The kind that says, I don't see where this is going, but I will keep walking anyway. The kind that says, I don't hear God speaking, but I will trust that he is still guiding my steps. The kind that holds on not because it feels hopeful, but because letting go would mean giving up on everything you still believe to be true about who God is. There is something deeply transformative about trusting God in the dark. It strips away the illusion of control. It forces you to confront the reality that you were never in charge to begin with. And that realization can be frightening, because control feels like safety. Understanding feels like security. And when both are removed, all you are left with is trust. Pure, unfiltered trust. And yet, this is often where the deepest growth happens. When you stop trying to figure everything out, and instead choose to surrender the need for answers. When you stop demanding explanations, and start resting in the belief that God's wisdom is greater than your understanding. This kind of surrender does not come naturally. It feels like weakness. It feels like vulnerability. But in reality, it is one of the strongest positions a person can take. Because trusting God in the dark means believing that His silence is not neglect, but intention. It means believing that even when you cannot trace His hand, you can still trust His heart. It means choosing to believe that God's goodness is not dependent on your current experience, but on His unchanging nature. There have always been people who walked this path before you. People who obeyed God and still found themselves in seasons of waiting. People who were faithful and still experienced loss. People who were chosen and still endured long stretches of uncertainty. Their stories remind us that silence has never been a sign that God has abandoned His people. It has often been the space where their faith matured. When God is silent, He is often shifting something inside you. He is building endurance. He is deepening humility. He is refining your motives. He is teaching you how to rely on Him rather than on outcomes. And while that process is uncomfortable, it is necessary. Because faith that only survives when God speaks is fragile. But faith that survives when God is silent is resilient. You may feel like you are standing still, like nothing is changing, like you are trapped in a waiting season that has no end. But waiting is not wasted time. Waiting is where trust is tested and strengthened. Waiting is where impatience is exposed and surrendered. Waiting is where faith learns to breathe without constant reassurance. And the hardest part of waiting is that you don't know how long it will last. If you knew the timeline, you could endure almost anything. But uncertainty stretches the soul. It forces you to live in the present moment without guarantees. And that is exactly why waiting requires faith. Because faith is not certainty about the future. Faith is confidence in God despite uncertainty. There will be moments when you want to give up. Moments when the silence feels unbearable. Moments when you wonder if trusting God like this is worth the pain. And in those moments, you need to remember that God sees you even when you feel unseen. He hears every unspoken prayer. He knows every tear you've held back. Nothing about your struggle is hidden from Him. Sometimes the breakthrough you are waiting for is not external. Sometimes the breakthrough is internal. It is the moment when peace replaces anxiety, even though nothing has changed. It is the moment when you realize you can rest in God without knowing the outcome. It is the moment when your faith stops being about what God will do and becomes about who God is. And that shift changes everything. Because when your trust is rooted in God's character rather than His actions, silence loses its power to shake you. You may still feel pain. You may still have questions. But you are no longer defined by them. You are anchored in something deeper. One day, often when you least expect it, you will look back on this season of darkness and realize that it taught you how to trust in a way nothing else could. You will realize that the silence refined your faith, that the waiting strengthened your endurance, that the uncertainty deepened your dependence on God. And you will see that even when God was quiet, He was never absent. But until that day comes, all you can do is keep walking, keep trusting, keep believing that the same God who carried you through past seasons is still holding you now. Even if you can't feel Him, even if you can't hear Him, even if you don't understand what He is doing. Trusting God in the dark is not about having all the answers. It is about choosing to stay faithful when answers are withheld. It is about believing that God's silence has purpose, even when that purpose is hidden. And if you can hold on through this season, if you can keep trusting, even when the path is unclear, you will emerge with a faith that is unshakable. A faith that does not depend on circumstances. A faith that has been tested, refined, and proven strong in the quiet places where only trust could survive. If you have listened this far, it means something inside you is still holding on. Even if you feel tired, even if you feel confused, even if your faith feels quieter than it used to. The fact that you are still here, still listening, still searching for meaning, is not an accident. It is evidence that God is still at work in you, even if you cannot see how. There are seasons in life when trusting God feels natural, and there are seasons when trusting God feels like the hardest thing you have ever had to do. This may be one of those seasons. A season where the path ahead is unclear, where the silence is heavy, where the questions feel louder than the answers. But this season does not define the end of your story. It is only a chapter. And chapters that feel the darkest often lead to the most powerful transformations. You may never fully understand why God allowed certain things to happen. You may never receive all the explanations you wish you had. But understanding was never the foundation of faith. Trust was. And trust does not mean pretending you are okay when you are not. Trust means choosing to believe that God is still good, still present, still guiding you, even when your emotions tell a different story. One day, perhaps long from now, you will look back at this moment with different eyes. You will see how the pain shaped you, how the waiting strengthened you, how the silence taught you to rely on God in ways comfort never could. You will realize that the same hand you thought was absent was actually holding you steady the entire time. Until that day comes, take one step at a time. You do not need to have everything figured out. You do not need to feel strong. You only need to keep trusting, even when you don't understand why. Because God sees what you cannot see. He knows where this road leads. And He has never once stopped walking beside you. So if your heart is heavy, let it rest here. If your faith feels fragile, let it breathe. And if you are struggling to trust God right now, know that you are not failing. You are growing. And the God who carried you this far will not let go now. Hold on. Keep trusting. Your story is still unfolding.